Now, I promised you a panel, and I have a panel to die for. So I'm going to bring up to the stage 4 people. I'm going to bring for you Amandine Pape, who is the... get the right slide. Amandine Pape, who is the co-founder at Matrix. I'm going to bring Dan Lorenc, who is the co-founder and CEO at ChainGuard. I'm going to bring Peter Zaitsev, our old friend Peter, who's the founder of Percona. And I'm going to bring my old friend, my very old friend, Luis Villa, who is the co-founder in GC at Tidelift and now VP at Sonar. So can I welcome you to the stage?
Has been way too long.
So, under pressure. Open source has been under pressure. These guys are going to be under pressure any minute, but we've been under pressure, I think, for a bit of time in open source, and we've been under pressure from different angles. There was a point, as I said a few years ago, where we were all celebrating. The success was unreal. We were so proud of what we'd achieved in open source. We had this scale of adoption, which was probably not matched by a scale of understanding. And we've got some challenges around business, we've got challenges around regulation, and we've got challenges around geopolitics. And I'm going to start on the business side. So over a couple of years, we have watched some of our favorite children, some of the leaders in our industry who we are so excited about, shifting their licenses, moving away from open source, telling us that they were under pressure. Peter, what's going on?
Exactly what you said.
Enlighten me. Expand on it. Tell me more.
Look, we see a lot of folks changing licenses, right, or abandoning open source, and not just quite that, right? I think there is this desire for a sake of maximizing monetization to having cake and eat it too, right? Or use open source not as an ethical paradigm, right? A way to contribute to society, create a public good, but as marketing to make some money, right? And I think that is what we have seen when the early days of open source happened. We have a lot of folks getting in the open source for reasons to to give back to community, to change the world, right? I remember when I joined MySQL many years ago, what we were saying about it, hey guys, we are going to revolutionize open source, make a difference, kick Oracle's ass. No, it was not.
And did you?
What?
And did you?
Well, it depends, right? But I think MySQL made a tremendous difference, right, in this case. But now also Oracle owns MySQL. And that is, I think, is the quintessential, right? Because when you get in bed in VPCs, those tend to be very smart people, and they, I think, tend to kind of, coerce in a different way the thinking of developers to say, hey, you know what? Making a difference in the world is not as important as having an island and a yacht and a private jet.
No, hang on. There is a brilliant quote last year from Alexis Richardson in one of our panels. I think it was just after his company went down. And he said if it came to a decision between paying his staff and being open source, he was going to pay his staff. So I don't think it's just people in their luxury yachts, Peter.
Yeah. Well, but I think the question here is the stuff. You choose to, and I think that is one of the layers, right? VCs tend to get you on a treadmill. Their motto is grow fast or die. And then you hire 100 developers. Then you could have maybe do with 10, right? If you would choose not to build in a business where you don't have to change a license, right? And then, of course, you get to that point, we're not monetizing with open source project as fast as I hope. And I dearly love my developers, so I have that nasty choice. Do I ditch open source or do I ditch my friends? Yes, many people choose friends, and I'm not saying that is a bad choice, right? But I think the question here is maybe kind of moving ahead about the sustainability, and you know what? Not growing as fast if open source is truly your choice, right? Now, I want to say that I am not open source zealot. I think the open source software and commercial software have to exist both. Sorry, Amanda.
No, it's fine. I'm not going to argue
right.
with you.
But if your choice is open source, right, you have to be very careful and understand this monetization which community can support.
And I think that gets back to this question of business models, right? And we weren't going to quite jump in here, but Lewis, I suspect that you've got something in business models that you know more about than almost anybody in funding the ecosystem.
I mean, we've only got 30 minutes left according to the timer here.
Yeah, so I'm going to keep you short.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that we are struggling with in this moment, and I'll be talking about later today, is that there's fundamentally, I think we've reached the end of the first generation of open source business models, right? We have been doing a lot of the same kinds of, we've run the same VC-backed playbook that that Peter's talking about for a lot of years now, and it's showing its strain in a number of ways, right? It's showing its strain in that regulators are finally realizing,
I'm going to keep you off regulators because we're going to come to them in a minute.
We're going to, well, I mean...
So let's stay off regulators, let's stay on business models.
Well, the thing is, I think the two are inextricable, right?
Okay,
so
then
we'll get more into the details, but suffice to say, like, when we are now a grown-up industry, we're going to need some grown-up business models, and that's going to include, you know, what we did at Tidelift. A lot of that was thinking about the fact that in an average industry, you know, we got some great data details this morning. My own favorite stat is that our customers at Tidelift used on average, about 5,000 pieces of open source, and depending on how you want to count, between 4,500 and 4,800 of those, so 90 to 95%, were pieces of open source that were developed by one person. Right? And now, you know...
So you don't mean one person did all of them. What you mean is those were single maintainer projects, right?
The line between those two things is pretty
close,
blurry, right?
Okay.
In fact, many of these small projects never have another contributor, right?
Yeah.
I don't have that number offhand. And that is the basis of our modern economy, right?
Yeah.
And that's a scary thing to base a supply chain on, because somebody wakes up one morning and decides, I think I'm going to chuck my laptops into the river. Who here has wanted to chuck all their laptops into a river? Yeah, I see. Yeah, that is not a great system to base an economy on. And so, you know, while those larger packages, the MySQLs of the world, Linux kernel, do get a lot of attention, should get a lot of attention in terms of their business models, open source is not a monolith, and lots of open source is these smaller packages.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely critical and something that not everybody agrees on or understands, but open source isn't a business model. It's many, many different things, and we can characterize it many different ways, but it's not a business model, and this is part of the challenge. We need an aligned business model if it's going to work, and the question is if, right?
Yeah, I mean, we need several aligned business models, right? Because open source is not a monolith, and so our business models are not going to be monolithic.
And I'm going to move on to Amandine. So when we're looking at these business models, we're thinking generally about enterprise. And 2 years ago on the stage, we had Mike Bracken, who is the founder of Government Digital Services here in the UK, GDS. And Mike said he thought there was a ninth business model, and I don't agree with him, which I told him at the time. And he said the ninth business model is the public sector, Amandine. He said there's funding there. What do you think?
So I think using public sector to fund open source is a way, but for me, it's a bootstrapping way. Like, you can use grants to bootstrap a project to support a small team. If you want the open source product to actually be sustainable, then you need some proper sustainable funding / revenue behind it. Otherwise, it's just a one-off. Governments don't have endless amount of money, and every year it's, oh, we're getting our budget cut down, and then they're funding a project, and then the next year they change priorities, and this project is not funding anymore. So what happened? It's not sustainable. We've been working a lot with public sector. And what we have been seeing is, on one side, as Avi was saying, public sector is using more and more of open source because they need the sovereignty, they need the transparency, and they need the lack of vendor lock-in. We need the ecosystem behind it. So that's good. It's been progressing a lot, but now we're hitting the next hurdle, which is the procurement of the open source. Yes, having a lot of people using projects, the entire economy resting on projects maintained by one person, it's ridiculous. So how do we actually get to educate public sector on how to buy open source? Often they get to it by, oh, let's just fund one feature, and who is going to maintain it? Oh, let's hire developers, and they will contribute software. Who is going to maintain it? Or let's just buy this from this system integrator who doesn't give back to the upstream project. And if you are building, even more if you're building a product which is end-user facing, then you cannot rely only on the contribution of the community of the open source, because you need a product guideline, you need a strong product delivery team. Who has ever used a product designed by committee as an end user? Doesn't exist. And as far as I know, I can think of only one end-user facing product which is mainstream, it's Firefox. That's it.
And just picking up on that, I want to point out a couple of things. So Henry, who's at the back, is going to speak to you when you leave the panel, I'm assuming, because he is working with the US government on teaching people in procurement how to procure open source. And in the conversation we had about this, and we have people from the public sector joining us to speak, in this conversation we talked about why does the public sector use open source? Generally, it uses it, not that dissimilar to companies, to avoid lock-in, and to ensure that the code that it's making, the code that it's distributing, is going to be recycled and reused. And the UK was the world's first to have that policy. You've probably all heard me say that multiple times, that public sector open source first policy. And we haven't been successful in the way we've done it. And no government in the world has been successful in the way we've done it, or they've done it. Switzerland last year put a law in place saying everything had to be open source, taking our policy, one step further. But the reality of that is it's the back end. It's the processes, it's the training, it's the understanding. And it's not just about giving you a grant to start you off. That's one of the things that's going to have to shift in the public sector so they contribute fairly and create an equitable situation where the code that's being used across our digital infrastructure is supported and maintained. And that shift is going to have to be towards paying for maintenance. Some of the money that's going into innovation is going to have to go into maintenance, and it's going to have to be spread in a way that makes sure that that single maintainer is getting what they need, as well as the big flashy projects. And actually, you'll see UKRI Innovate UK have a table, and we've been talking a great deal with them about how in the UK we can build this, and we will continue as Open UK to do it. I think it's absolutely critical, and you'll hear more about that through the whole of the conference. So just before we move off of business models, I want to come to you, Dan, and talk about Sentry, who are here with us, and they're going to be doing a project. So Peter was talking about this shift away from open source. We have a wonderful session coming up after this panel called Meet the Forkers, and you'll hear me say that many, many times because I think it's hilarious, and I'll probably laugh until I cry as I tell you it. So before we meet the Forkers, we are already seeing this license shift. We're already seeing a kind of software sitting there that isn't really open source because it doesn't meet our standard. There's no free flow. And at the same time, if you call it proprietary, you create a war, right? Dan?
Yeah, I think you touched on a couple really interesting points there. One is around the procurement of open source. And I think one of the reasons open source has gotten so pervasive is it's largely lived outside of that procurement system. Open source is code, it's these beliefs, it's this ethos, but most importantly, it's this definition on these freedoms that have to be in place on a license to be considered open source. Over the last 20 and 30 years, lawyers inside of companies have gotten comfortable with those protections, and that's why they don't review every single license and every single patch and every single piece of IP coming into a company because it's open source. If it meets those definitions, they understand and they're generally good with it. Developers don't have to go ask their legal teams to review every PR. No developer here wants to have to do that. So open source has kind of gotten everywhere because it hasn't been part of that procurement system. That doesn't mean there's no value exchanged. There is value in source code. You can sell source code. But open source licenses have officially put a stamp on that saying we declare the value of this to be 0. We're giving it away to you for free. So to get value flowing back into this ecosystem, you need some other type of market dynamic to make that work. And I think what you said toward the end there is correct. Maintenance is that piece. People pay money for value. They don't pay money to feel good. They don't pay money because it's the right thing to do. The value of open source, there's a Harvard census study that tried to put a price on this. It was a $4 billion one-time replacement fee. If all the open source in the world disappeared and you had an amazing engineering team that could always deliver things on time and on target, it would cost $4 billion once to redo all of that. And that's in a shared manner. If you look at the value captured by society using that, if every company had to go fund that on their own instead of reusing that open source, it was a 2,000x leverage. Not everyone would need every piece of open source, but it was somewhere around $8 trillion of value being captured by that. So it's great for society, but it kind of lives outside of the normal market dynamics, and that's the shift that we're seeing here.
Absolutely. And this space we've got now where we have 3 categories of software, if you look back at Open UK's reports, we've been talking about this for a while, and the way we've defined it is a sort of delta, where open source software requires you to share your code so that anybody can use it for any purpose. But the cost of that is effectively you're enabling your competitors with your innovation. And that's a tough thing to bear. So I'm planning to move us into the regulatory space. Anybody objecting on the panel? Anything that burning desire to? Right, we're going regulatory. So the first problem, the first challenge that open source has really been facing has been this business one. We aren't a business model. How do we build business models? How do we get funded? How do we fund the maintainers? But we've been super successful, and as Dan said, one of the main reasons for that is the pace of adoption, and that pace of adoption has happened for many reasons, one of which is the sort of GitHub, the collaborative repositories, one of which is the standard licenses that you can rely on and trust. And as we've expanded, I said already that the pace of adoption has not been matched by a pace of understanding, which is a critical challenge for us. And what we see is regulators suddenly realizing that this software is relied on for all of our delivery of services. And that, that's really growing up. And that's not where open source started, right? But it's what we wanted, we thought. So we asked for everybody to use our code. We asked for people to stop using proprietary code and replace it with open source. And we got it. And inevitably, in getting that, what's happened is that the lawmakers, the policymakers, want to see somebody being responsible for that. Now, that doesn't quite match the proprietary model of somebody being responsible for it. And we have a friction. But somebody, somewhere in that supply chain, in that ecosystem, is going to be asked to take liability. Somebody is going to manage that risk, because the governments themselves, the public sectors themselves, are never going to want to do it. So, Lewis, I can't help, old lawyer friend, we've known each other maybe nearly 20 years. I knew you before you were a lawyer. You've been engaged in the Cyber Resilience Act. You've been dealing with European policymakers, US policymakers. Talk to me about how this is working out. Talk to me about who's lobbying on behalf of open source. Talk to me about how those decisions are being made, how we're being protected.
Well, first, a moment of silence for American regulators. My CEO emailed me, said, oh, yeah, well, I saw a Biden executive order, for
404 message.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I had to tell him that the team that was tasked with implementing that essentially no longer exists, which is funny, but of course also tragic. Because it is such an important moment, right? We are the dog who caught the car. We kept saying, yeah, we want the entire world to depend on us. Now the entire world depends on us, and not
like this.
And so the Cyber Resilience Act, I think, is going to be the big action in the next few years. It's going to take about 3 years to go into effect. And I think one of the things that somewhat shocks me about this process as an American is that the EU has passed a law and now they're busy figuring out what's in it, and which does seem somewhat backwards. And I think from and actually I will say, I just got in from Brussels on Sunday. We spent several days talking with folks from the Commission. They are listening very, very hard. They're genuinely trying to do the right thing. But the people at the table are, remember what I was saying about how the vast majority of open source is small individuals. Now that's on a project count, which is different from lines of code, different from the value that Dan was talking about. So it's only one metric of many. But those folks don't have Brussels lobbying teams, right? And whereas the Linux Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, those folks, Eclipse is literally located in Brussels, those folks are showing up at the table. And not unreasonably, they're often representing their projects. They're saying things like, oh yeah, of course we can do this, when it's really unclear how that's going to work for smaller open source, which is still the bulk of open source. And some of these regulations are very reasonable. They're things we need to do anyway, like software bills of material. I'm sure we're going to hear more about those in coming days. Software bills of materials, for those not familiar with it, sometimes called SBOMs, are basically lists of what is contained within your software. And we've been talking about them now for 15 of those 20 years that we've known each other, and still adoption is vanishingly small, right? And we're not necessarily grappling with the whys and the hows of that. I know, Dan, you've been thinking a lot about that particular angle of the problem, of course, but it's, you know, it can be simultaneously true that open is really leading the entire software industry in security and thoughtfulness about how all this stuff works together, and also that we're terrible at writing it down. And I think regulation is going to try to square that circle, and it's going to be a painful few years while we figure that out.
So as we figure it out, we're seeing a lot going on there, and you've mentioned foundations. One of the things that I think is a bit of a conundrum with the CRA is the split level of liability. So you have this steward concept, where if your code is in a foundation, you have a different level of liability to meet. How is that going to fathom out? How is that going to play out? Where do you see that going?
I mean, I think one of the things that we're going to see is some consolidation, right? The EU, about, less than 18 months ago, 14, 16 months ago, just said, if you put open source on the market, you're liable. And then a whole bunch of people stood up and said, we literally don't think we can do that, right? Like, actually, a close reading of the text suggested that it would be impossible to distribute GPL license code in the EU. And so at that point, when that was pointed out, a lot of big EU companies, Siemens, Mercedes-Benz, et cetera, were like, oh, you know, we're Linux distributors. We'd like to keep doing that. And so a carve-out was added for open source stewards, which are sort of organizations, think again, foundations. I think we're going to see a lot more of those pop up, and I think we're going to see a lot of smaller projects go into some variation of those, because the alternative is, I mean, there's an even bigger carve-out if you were just an open source maintainer.
Yeah.
But people are going to be afraid of crossing that line.
So long as you don't commercialize.
Yeah, as long as you don't commercialize.
But most people eat.
Well, yeah, how do people eat? What does commercialization even mean? Is that taking one consulting check? Is that taking free tickets to a nice conference?
So I'm going to move on, Lewis. I'm going to move over to Dan. We talk about this maturation quite a lot. This is coming up as a sort of common thread in what you're all saying to me. And Dan has just been to Davos. I'm going to proudly tell you tomorrow that I'm going to the AI summit in Paris with 500 other people. Dan has just come back from Davos. I don't know how many people go to Davos, but it's very fancy, very grown up. And there's suddenly a space at the table for the open source community and some of these big, powerful events. And that's a shift, right? So tell us about Davos. Tell us what's going on in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way you explain the story of the CRA, I think, is a good one. You know, the first drafts of it were literally impossible to analyze or execute, and it's because lawmakers and folks doing this don't really have a good way to engage with the open source communities because, yeah, what do? Get every single maintainer to show up and lobby together? They just don't understand it. They're not necessarily trying to kill open source, but from a layman who doesn't understand how this works on the outside, maybe that seemed like a good idea. Just make the person that wrote the code liable. And now there has been a space created. It's still hard to fill up with individual maintainers and get representatives from all these different communities. And then the stewardship concept came because those foundations showed up because they were equipped to. This is happening all over the world. Like Amanda just said, I was at Davos a few weeks ago, and they brought up the same thing over and over again. Of like, we know open source is critical. They had a cyber report showing that 50% of organizations' top risk was supply chain vulnerabilities, and open source is somewhere around 90% of everyone's supply chain. They just don't know who to invite. There's no single president of open source that you can come that represents, the body. It's kind of like an anarchist movement, not a government with representatives when you look at it that way.
I think that's a huge challenge, right? Who do you invite? And within the UK, Open UK brings together a group of lawyers, and those lawyers have been working in open source for a very long time. And we can leverage that understanding of open source. But one of the problems you have is this disconnect, finding people who understand how legislation is made, who are willing to work with the open source community. And if you've got those skills now, you can make a lot of money in a big company, right? So it is quite a challenge to get the right people funneling in. But I'm wondering also, Amandine, how is that playing out in your business? How are you dealing with all this regulation coming down the line?
I think as a business, we're probably the best place for it. The tricky thing is, of course, finding the resources to actually go follow what's going on and make sure we have a good understanding on the impact. And that's quite expensive. But some regulations like CRA, I think, are more worrying for smaller contributors and smaller organizations. If you are a business and you're managing to get some revenue, it's extra resources that you were not planning to use, but it's still something you can probably deal with. I think some regulations are making it harder to do open source business, but some others can be helping. Thinking the Digital Markets Act, for example, which we're mandating interop for big tech companies. This has been enabling some open source businesses a bit more. So I think it's good to continue to work with the regulator. On the procurement side of things, again, working with the European Commission, working with the government, educating them, making sure they understand what's happening behind an open source software is the key. It's just starting. There's a lot to do, but I think that's progressing.
And one of the challenges we've had around this regulation is that some of this regulation is driven out of geopolitical shift. And one of the great things about open source is that it's a worldwide community of contributors, right? The innovation comes from people all over the world. But you have a friction now, and you have a friction and geopolitical shift even if you are not looking at open source, right? There's a lot going on. We've had a week of tariff announcements. Who knows where all of this stuff is going? But we also have seen this in the last few months in open source. And on Friday, Linux Foundation issued a policy note around sanctions. But we saw in the summer that a number of Russian developers were excluded from the Linux kernel as maintainers. I believe they were still able to contribute, but they weren't able to maintain their code anymore. They were removed from the project on that basis. And that's how Dan and I met, actually, because we met on LinkedIn in a conversation where Dan and I totally disagree about this, which is a good thing, right? Healthy disagreement is what this conversation should be all about. So, Dan, will I come to you first and let you talk a little bit about how you see this? And bear in mind the whole conversation around Davos and security to contextualize this.
Sure. And there's a lot of nuance here in between, what an ideal world would look like versus the laws that we all actually have to operate in. But yeah, the open source, we love to pretend that it's just this free movement and everyone can do whatever they want on GitHub. But open source is underpinned by a whole bunch of laws already that people just tend to forget about. It's IP law, there's copyright law. When you make a contribution, that's a transfer of intellectual property from you to that maintainer. There's CLA processes that some projects use to keep track of that, DCOs. Lawyers are very important in open source, even though you don't have to deal with them and think about them every day.
You've not seen the LinkedIn post that Bart Farrell did last night, obviously. What was it? Pedantic lawyer.
Yeah. So what the Linux Foundation just released and some of the changes they had to go through this summer were around complying with sanctions. Sanctions are another form of law. And sanctions are a diplomatic form of resolution to violent conflict, basically. They're helping to prevent violent conflict in the world by using economic and other means. The Linux Foundation determined that those sanctions against Russian, not just Russian, 6 or 7 different sanctioned entities across the world, do apply to the transfer of intellectual property in open source. And they published a really helpful guide to try to help maintainers understand what it means for them, because these laws are very, very strict ones. You don't have to know you're violating them to be in trouble for doing it. The burden is on you as the person interacting with these entities to prove that they're not sanctioned. Anonymous GitHub accounts, all of that, it doesn't matter. You actually have to know that you're not interacting with someone that is on one of those sanction lists.
And if that's going to be the case, that's something that's going to apply to the whole of open source. And something I talk quite a lot about as a SADX lawyer is the fact that we have our licenses and we know what the licenses say. We know what we think we are giving people when we give them the right to use our code and give them our copyright. But what we have to remember is that law trumps licensing. So whatever country the code is being used in, the law applies. And we've seen some of the big techs choose not to put their AI into the EU in recent months because they don't want to be subject to those laws. You have a choice about where you distribute your code. But when we look at this environment, at this situation, we also see SFLC, the Software Freedom Law Software Conservancy, writing a different opinion, saying that they don't think that it's a possible interpretation, of course they've said, but they don't think that you have to do this. So we've got a bit of friction in the legal advice right now that we need to resolve. Peter, just 1 second. Peter, I want to come to you on the, and I will come back to you, Lewis, but we haven't got a lot of time. But Peter, sanctions. I know you've got some opinions around this and around open source.
Yes, well, absolutely. Look, and I'm not a lawyer, right? So I cannot, thankfully so, right? So, but I cannot comment on wherever it's legal or not and what consequences are, right? I think what it is very common, right, and especially in those tense times, then the law comes in a conflict with what is right, right? And I think that is the situation we have here. I think some of you may know those, some of the, communist chases in the United States, right? Or the statement by, I forgot who it is, we know he's son of bitch, and, murders people, but he's our son of bitch, which kind of supports our values, right? So in my opinion, that is the thing what we are doing here. I think this is something like what we have of a baby throwing out a baby with a bathtub water, would say, right, if you think about the approach to this. Because I think sanctions are in particularly, have no good purpose when it comes to open source. When you speak about security, supply chain security, well, you know what, the bad guys, believe me, it's not a problem for them to pretend they're not in Russia or not to be in Russia, right? There's like so many countries where we can go, right? Also, it is not selling some, high-end technology to Russia or other those countries, right? Well, some of the, what is called like a Red Star OS in North Korea, their kind of, wonderful control thing is based on Linux. And of course, they have access to open source to use it to repress their people, right? And you wouldn't be able to really stop it, because how things are distributed. So yeah, in my opinion, again, I don't know what is the legal, but I think that is not right, and that is going to also potentially be the problematic for the leadership of those countries in the open source space.
And
right?
I think what we saw, Peter, was an immediate reaction from the Russian Digital Ministry, where they said they were going to fork the kernel and collaborate with any country that was willing to work with them. And I think there's a piece there where we're all going to have to work together and work out how we manage some of these frictions, manage protecting this global collaboration that we value so highly. as we move through this maturation process.
Yeah, well-
Louis, look, hang on, Peter. Louis, we're running out of time.
Yeah,
We've got
okay,
2
so
minutes
just
left.
be-
I'm going to give you 30 seconds.
I'll take 15.
Okay, better.
The thing that Dan was saying, this has all been underpinned by IP and contract law. Those are two of the most global bodies of law, and we got spoiled, right? We were like, oh yeah, law works basically the same everywhere. And what's happening right now is we're being very forcefully reminded that that is not the case, right? And that's a mind shift that's really hard for Open to wrap its head around.
So I'm going to go to a quick fire last question to each panelist. And I know you could probably listen to them all day, and I would like them to expand on a lot of what we're talking about. Some of them will be across different panels over the next 2 days. I think everybody here is going to be around for quite a lot of the day if you want to speak to them. I want to come back to you, Louis. So you have your other 15 seconds. What needs to change in the way we deal with policymakers?
We need to just accept that they're real. Right?
Okay.
They're not just imaginary people in a faraway place. They have power.
They have power, but also they deserve us to take the time to build relationships with them, I think, to help them to understand and take them on a journey with us. Amandine, single request of funders, what would it be?
If we want open source to be used and compete with proprietary products, we need professional teams to build professional products. And this can only happen if we get some sustainable funding for these projects.
Peter, what can we do to improve future businesses?
Oh, well, if you want the innovation
30 seconds.
for governments, right, leave the innovators alone.
Okay, leave innovators alone. Dan, we're going to talk a lot about AI tomorrow. There is so much AI content I cannot tell you. But I promised that I would let you, since you and I don't agree on an awful lot of things, say something about the open source AI definition.
It's a good first step, actually.
As I said, we don't agree on a lot of things. Ladies and gentlemen, they've been fabulous. Thank you to our panel.